The entire history of the United States. Before it was a superpower, before it had a flag, an anthem, or even a name, it was an idea, whispered in taverns, printed on illegal pamphlets, and paid for in blood. Most people think American history begins in 1776. It doesn't. It begins over 200 years earlier, with a handful of starving colonists on a strange coastline, gambling everything on a continent that did not want them. By the time this story ends, that gamble will build the most powerful nation in human history and nearly destroy itself twice, trying to decide what freedom actually means. This is the entire history of the United States, not the sanitized version, the real one. Messy, brutal, brilliant, and unfinished.
A continent already lived in. Long before any European sail appeared on the horizon, North America was not empty. It was home to hundreds of distinct nations. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy in the northeast, the Mississippian mound builders along the Great River, the Puebloan peoples of the desert southwest. Millions of people, thousands of years of history, entire civilizations with their own governments, trade networks, and wars. Then, in 1492, everything changed. Not because a new world was discovered, but because two worlds that never knew each other collided. What followed was one of the deadliest events in human history. Waves of disease, conquest, and displacement that would kill an estimated 90% of the indigenous population within a century. This is the uncomfortable foundation beneath everything that follows. By the early 1600s, European powers were racing to plant flags on this bloodied ground. The Spanish had Florida and the Southwest. The French claimed the North. And in 1607, a group of English colonists, half-starved, poorly prepared, obsessed with finding gold that didn't exist, founded a settlement they named Jamestown. It nearly failed completely. Of the first several hundred settlers, most died within years. But it survived. And 13 years later, a different kind of ship arrived further north, the Mayflower, carrying religious separatists seeking not gold, but freedom to worship as they chose. Freedom, notably, that they would.
13 colonies, one growing tension. Over the next century and a half, 13 British colonies grew along the Atlantic coast, each with its own economy, religion, and character. New England built ships and churches. The middle colonies built farms and diversity. The South built an economy increasingly dependent on a horror that would define American history for the next 200 years: the enslavement of African people, kidnapped and transported across the Atlantic in chains. By the mid-1700s, these colonies were prosperous, and Britain wanted its cut. After the costly 7 Years' War against France, the British Crown began taxing the colonies to pay its debts. Stamps, tea, sugar. Each tax seemed small. Each one lit a fuse. The colonists' response became a rallying cry that still echoes in American political speech today. No taxation without representation. In Boston Harbor in 1773, colonists dumped an entire shipment of British tea into the water rather than pay the tax on it. A piece of political theater that would push the empire and its colonies to the brink. Britain responded with punishment, not compromise. And in April 1775, on a village green in Massachusetts, someone, to this day no one knows who, fired a shot. The American Revolution had begun.
A declaration and a desperate war. In the summer of 1776, delegates from all 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia. A committee, including a quiet, brilliant Virginian named Thomas Jefferson, drafted a document that would become one of the most consequential pieces of writing in human history: the Declaration of Independence. Its words were revolutionary: that all men are created equal, endowed with unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Its hypocrisy was immediate and glaring. The man who wrote those words enslaved over 600 human beings in his lifetime. This contradiction, soaring ideals against brutal reality, would haunt the nation for centuries. The war itself was a desperate gamble. The Continental Army, led by George Washington, was underfed, underpaid, and outmatched by the world's most powerful military. They lost more battles than they won. They nearly froze to death at Valley Forge. But they endured. And when France entered the war on the American side, the tide began to turn. In 1781, at Yorktown, the British Army surrendered. Against every reasonable expectation, 13 scattered colonies had defeated an empire.
Building a nation from scratch. Independence was won. Now came the harder question. What kind of country would this actually be? The first attempt, the Articles of Confederation, created a government too weak to function. So in 1787, delegates gathered again in Philadelphia, this time to write a constitution. What emerged was a radical experiment, a government of checks and balances, split between three branches, designed specifically to prevent any single person or faction from seizing total power. But the Constitution was also built on brutal compromise. To secure the support of Southern states, it enshrined slavery into the nation's founding law, counting enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for representation purposes while denying them any rights at all. The nation's original sin was written into its own blueprint. George Washington became the first president, setting precedents that would shape the office for centuries, including the unprecedented act of voluntarily walking away from power after 2 terms. The young republic stumbled through its first decades. Political parties formed, despite the founders' fears. A new capital city rose from swampland. And in 1803, President Jefferson doubled the size of the country overnight with the Louisiana Purchase.
Expansion and the cost of it. The 19th century became the story of relentless westward expansion, driven by a belief Americans called manifest destiny, the conviction that the nation was destined to stretch from ocean to ocean. This expansion came at catastrophic human cost. Indigenous nations who had lived on this land for millennia were forced from their homes through broken treaties, military campaigns, and outright ethnic cleansing. Most infamously, the Trail of Tears, where thousands of Cherokee people died on a forced march westward. At the same time, the institution of slavery was expanding too, not weakening as some founders had hoped, but hardening into the economic backbone of the South, driven by the invention of the cotton gin. Nearly 4 million human beings lived in bondage by the mid-1800s. The nation was, quite literally, being pulled apart by 2 irreconcilable economic and moral systems. The nation tears itself apart. By 1860, compromise had run out. The election of Abraham Lincoln, who opposed the expansion of slavery, was the final trigger. 11 Southern states seceded, forming the Confederacy, determined to preserve slavery at any cost. The bloodiest war in American history had begun. The Civil War killed more Americans than every other American war combined, an estimated 750,000 lives lost. It was a war of trenches and cannon fire, of brother against brother, fought across farmland that became killing fields. Gettysburg, Antietam, Shiloh. In 1863, in the middle of the war, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, transforming the war's purpose from preserving the Union into ending slavery itself. In 1865, the Confederacy collapsed. Slavery was abolished. An industrial giant awakens. Out of the war's ashes, America transformed with breathtaking speed. Railroads stitched the continent together. Steel, oil, and finance created a new class of industrial titans. Carnegie, Rockefeller, Morgan, whose fortunes dwarfed the wealth of nations. Immigrants poured in by the millions, drawn by opportunity, crammed into crowded cities, building the physical infrastructure of a new industrial superpower with their labor. But this Gilded Age had a dark underside: child labor, deadly factory conditions, and a staggering gap between industrial wealth and worker poverty. It sparked the rise of labor unions, of reform movements, and of the Progressive era's fight to rein in unchecked corporate power. By 1917, internal transformation gave way to global involvement as America entered the First World War, emerging from the conflict, for the first time, as a genuine world power.
Boom, bust, and a world at war. The 1920s roared with jazz, prosperity, and reckless financial speculation. Then, in October 1929, the stock market collapsed, triggering the Great Depression, a decade of devastating unemployment and poverty that reshaped Americans' relationship with their government forever. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal fundamentally redefined the role of the federal government, creating social safety nets that still exist today. But it was a second global catastrophe that truly ended the Depression. In December 1941, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor pulled America into the Second World War. What followed was the largest mobilization in the nation's history. Millions of soldiers, an industrial machine converted entirely to war production, and a role in defeating fascism across two oceans. America emerged from 1945 not just victorious, but transformed into the most powerful nation on Earth, while also unleashing at Hiroshima and Nagasaki a weapon that would define the anxieties of the following decades.
A superpower divided against itself. The post-war decades brought unprecedented prosperity: suburbs, highways, television, a booming middle class. But beneath the surface, the nation confronted the unfinished business of its founding contradictions. The civil rights movement, led by figures like Martin Luther King Jr., confronted a century of segregation and violence with extraordinary courage, forcing the country to finally begin dismantling the legal architecture of racial apartheid built after Reconstruction. Simultaneously, the Cold War against the Soviet Union defined foreign policy for nearly 50 years, an ideological struggle that pulled America into proxy wars in Korea and Vietnam, fueled a nuclear arms race, and sent astronauts to the surface of the moon in 1969 as a demonstration of technological supremacy. The late 20th century brought further upheaval. Watergate shattered public trust in government, economic shifts hollowed out industrial cities, and in 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union left the United States as the world's sole superpower.
Into the 21st century, the new millennium brought new tests. The September 11th attacks in 2001 reshaped American national security policy for a generation, leading to prolonged wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. The 2008 financial crisis exposed deep fractures in the American economy, triggering the worst recession since the Great Depression. Through it all, the same tension that has defined this nation since its founding, the gap between its stated ideals and its lived reality, continued to play out in new forms. Debates over healthcare, immigration, racial justice, and the very nature of democracy itself, tested most visibly by the events of January 6, 2021.
Look back across this story, and one thread runs through all 4 centuries of it. A nation perpetually at war with its own contradictions, born proclaiming that all men are created equal while building an economy on slavery, expanding a continent of liberty while committing atrocities against the people who already lived there, becoming the world's arsenal of democracy while struggling again and again to extend that democracy fully to its own citizens. The United States has never been a finished project. It has always been an argument between its ideals and its actions, between what it claims to be and what it has yet to become. That argument built cities, fought wars, freed the enslaved, and put footprints on the moon.
And that argument is still being written today by every generation that inherits it. That is the real story of America. Not a myth of destiny fulfilled, but the story of an unfinished experiment, still testing whether its founding promise can ever fully become real. If this journey through 400 years of American history gave you a new perspective, make sure to subscribe, because this channel exists to tell the stories behind the headlines, the wars, and the words that shape the world we live in today. There's so much more history waiting to be uncovered. See you in the next one.